increasingly worried about their drinking. You've got the Attorney General of the US saying that packaging of alcohol should have a cancer warning. You've got a new generation, Gen Z, who are much more sober curious, as they would say, than previous generations. So I think the worry from an alcohol perspective is that really, people are starting to realise actually that drinking comes with serious risks to your health.
And I'm curious about the younger generation because there's so much debate as to why, this term sober curious, which is an interesting one, I hadn't heard that before, why they're sober curious and why they are shying away from alcohol. I'm curious, if you want to weigh in on that, then I can ask my next question.
It's a really good question. I think actually we've seen the general population, particularly in Europe, kind of moving away from alcohol the last few decades. So I think in a way the younger generations just are kind of increasing that trend that was already building. But I think the young always kind of position themselves against their elders and tend to do the opposite of what their elders do, and their parents are quite big drinkers. So I think a lot of them have decided that actually, it's not a good look, I don't really want to do that. And I think also that they are probably the most health obsessed generation that we've ever seen. They've been born in an era of social media where you've got health influencers all over the place, a lot more kind of health knowledge as well. So that's really shaped their thinking.
And what about in the US? My next question is around marijuana usage. We've seen marijuana usage rise in the US. We're seeing a lot of traction in some states around legalizing marijuana. To what extent is that a substitute for drinking among this younger generation?
I think to a certain extent, you see from the polling data that the young are much more positive about marijuana than they are about alcohol. They consider you get less of a hangover. They consider some real upsides to it. So I think that's inevitably going to eat into some of the share. The two don't mix particularly well, and that's kind of the perception of consumers. And then the other worry would be the weight loss drugs, and that's the big question mark. So there is some evidence that weight loss drugs actually make you less likely to want to have alcohol. And if weight loss, particularly in the US, becomes a mainstream thing that a lot of consumers are doing, then that's going to have a huge impact on the alcohol industry.
To what extent will these companies be able to make up for lost alcohol sales with 0% alternatives? They're investing so heavily in these, but then obviously they're competing with traditional non-alcoholic drinks makers. So is this a feasible strategy?
I think it's going to be hard because I think the sales revenue from non-alcoholic beer and wine and spirits is just a fraction of alcohol sales. So I think they're relying more on premiumization. But when you've got the threat of tariffs, consumers are less likely to want to shell out a lot of money for premium spirits. So I think there's a real risk that they're not going to be able to make up for the shortfall in pure alcohol sales.
What about the direct impact of these tariffs? We've obviously seen a delay to the Mexico and Canada tariffs that were announced by the Trump administration, but the threat looms large. So you mentioned the impact of tariffs from a consumer perspective and what that might do to prices. But what does it mean more directly for these drinks makers?
Well, alcohol particularly really relies on exports. So you've got tequila has to be made in Mexico, so there's no room for maneuver. There's no way you could shift that to an American factory. You've got the same for Scotch in Scotland, and Diageo in particular is hugely exposed because it relies a lot now on tequila and Scotch sales. Tequila in particular to the US, it's been one of the booming sectors in the last decade. There are already signs that was beginning to recede, and this is going to hit that even further.
It sounds like such a grim outlook for this sector. So, typically when you hear that, the next question is around consolidation. Are we going to see these companies come together to try to, save themselves effectively? What do you think the future looks like?
Yeah, I think the alcohol industry has always been an industry that favours consolidation. I think that some of the share prices now of the alcohol companies will make them viable.